January 25th, 1945. 2:14 hours. 200 feet below the icy waters of the La Perouse Strait, the American submarine USS Barb shudders and then stops dead. At her controls is Lieutenant Commander Eugene B. Fluckey, a former farm boy turned submariner, now trapped on the ocean floor in enemy waters. The Barb was never meant to be here. Her steel hull is pressed into rock and mud, batteries draining, air growing foul by the minute. Above them prowls the enemy, a Japanese destroyer, bristling with sonar, depth charges, and a reputation for killing submarines without mercy. One ping, one suspicious ripple, and the Barb will be crushed like a tin can. This is an impossible matchup, a grounded submarine, barely able to move, versus a fast, modern hunter built to destroy boats exactly like this. And Fluckey has no torpedoes to fire, no room to dive, only minutes to think. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a brutal, grinding phase. Japan's once dominant navy had been shattered in open battle, but its empire had not yet collapsed. Instead, the conflict shifted into a deadly contest of attrition and strangulation, where American submarines became the quiet executioners of Japan's war economy. The campaign surrounding the USS Barb was part of Operation Starvation, an unofficial but devastating effort to sever Japan's remaining supply lines. Oil from Sakhalin, coal from Manchuria, food from the Asian mainland, almost all of it still had to move by sea. And by 1945, submarines were the only practical way to stop it. On paper, the United States had the advantage. Dozens of fleet submarines roamed the Western Pacific, hunting merchant ships and military escorts. In reality, it was still a dangerous, uneven fight. Japanese coastal waters were narrow, shallow, and heavily patrolled. Destroyers, escorts, and patrol craft used sonar and depth charges relentlessly, turning choke points into underwater killing zones. The La Perouse Strait, between Hokkaido and Sakhalin, was one of those zones. For the Japanese Navy, this strait was critical. It funneled shipping carrying coal and supplies essential for industry and winter survival. Losing control of it meant factories would go dark and cities would freeze. To defend it, the Japanese deployed destroyers and escorts under strict doctrine, aggressive sonar sweeps, immediate depth charge attacks, and zero tolerance for risk. The commanders tasked with this defense were experienced, disciplined, and increasingly desperate. They knew the war was turning against them, and they knew submarines with a knife at their throat. For American submariners, the situation was just as grim, but in a different way. The U.S. Navy's official submarine doctrine was still built around deep-water operations. Attack from depth, fire torpedoes, dive away silently. That doctrine worked well in the open Pacific. It worked far less well in confined, shallow waters like the La Perouse Strait. Here, the ocean floor itself became a weapon. Fleet submarines like the Barb were large, powerful, and fast underwater, but they needed depth to maneuver. In shallow water, a single miscalculation could put a boat on the bottom, pinned by gravity and mud. Diving too deep meant grounding. Rising too high meant radar or visual detection. There was almost no margin for error. Worse still were the lingering technical failures that haunted the U.S. submarine force for much of the war. Although many problems had been fixed by 1945, submariners still live with a memory of faulty torpedoes, weapons that ran too deep, failed to detonate, or veered off course. Every attack carried the psychological weight of wondering whether the weapon would work at all. Aggressive patrols were demanded from Washington, but each patrol meant threading the needle between success and disaster. And disaster was common. By late 1944, American submarines were winning, but at a cost. Boats were being lost to mines, air patrols, and skilled destroyer crews. In narrow straits, a submarine detected once was often attacked until destroyed. Depth charge patterns were methodical, patient, and lethal. The human toll was heavy. Crews operated under constant stress, weeks without sunlight, stale air thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and fear. Men slept inches from torpedoes and batteries that could explode or leak gas. In shallow water patrols, the anxiety was worse. Every sonar ping sounded closer. Every course correction felt like a gamble. It was into this environment that USS Barb was sent. Her mission was aggressive by design, penetrate enemy-controlled waters, sink shipping, and disrupt Japanese movement at the very edge of their homeland. It required boldness bordering on recklessness, and it required commanders willing to bend, or break, accepted rules. The fatal flaw in the situation was simple and unforgiving. Submarine doctrine assumed freedom of movement. In places like the La Perouse Strait, that freedom did not exist. One wrong trim adjustment, one unexpected current, one moment of hesitation, and a submarine could become a steel coffin on the seabed, which is exactly what happened. As the Barb crept through the strait, evading patrols and navigating treacherous depths, she slipped just a little too low. Her keel scraped rock, then mud, then she stopped entirely. Now, doctrine had nothing left to offer. Pinned to the ocean floor, batteries draining, enemy ships above, the Barb and her crew were about to discover that survival would depend not on regulations or manuals, but on improvisation, nerve, and a willingness to do something no submarine crew was ever trained to attempt. Eugene Bennett Fluckey was not the kind of officer the Navy designed by committee. Before the war, he had been a farm boy from Michigan, raised on problem-solving that didn't involve manuals or committees. On a farm, when machinery broke, you fix it with whatever worked, not what was authorized. That mindset followed him to the U.S. Naval Academy and then into submarines, where rigid doctrine often collided with brutal reality. By January 1945, Fluckey was already known as aggressive, imaginative, and quietly dangerous to enemy shipping. He believed submarines were wasted if they simply followed predictable patterns. His crew trusted him because his risks were calculated, and because he listened to enlisted men as closely as officers. Now, that mindset was about to be tested to its limit. The Barb lay hard aground, her hull wedged into mud and rock. Standard procedure offered only grim options: blow ballast tanks with compressed air and hope the boat floated free. But that procedure assumed something critical, that the hull could move once buoyancy increased. The Barb didn't budge. Each attempt to blow ballast drained precious high-pressure air. That air was also needed to surface, to fight fires, to breathe. Use too much, and the submarine would become a sealed tomb. Worse, the ocean floor here was not smooth sand. It was sticky, glacial mud, thick enough to grip the hull like wet cement. The more they tried to rise, the more suction held them down. Fluckey needed something no rulebook mentioned: lubrication. The idea came not from a textbook, but from instinct and from listening. Some accounts credit Fluckey himself. Others suggest an enlisted sailor voice at first. Either way, the spark was simple and brilliant: reduce friction. If the mud could be made slippery, the hull might break free. There was only one substance on board in sufficient quantity that could do that. In peacetime, dumping supplies into ballast tanks would have been unthinkable. In wartime, it bordered on mutiny by innovation. Ballast systems were sacred. Contaminating them could clog valves, damage systems, and cripple the boat permanently. And if it failed, Fluckey would not just lose his command, he would likely lose his crew. But doing nothing meant certain destruction. So he gave the order. Sailors emptied every container they could find: galley soap, powder cleaners, anything slick, into the forward ballast tanks. It was an act completely outside Navy regulations, undocumented, unauthorized, and untested. This was a crime, deliberately altering a submarine's critical systems with household supplies while trapped under enemy waters. Then Fluckey ordered another controlled blow of ballast. Compressed air roared into the tanks. Soap mixed with seawater, coating metal surfaces and venting outward through flood ports. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the Barb shifted. Not much, just enough. The suction loosened. The hull slid inches. Then a foot, another blow, more movement. The mud that had held them like a fist began to lose its grip. The submarine rose, slowly, agonizingly, but unmistakably. Against all expectations, the Barb broke free of the ocean floor. There was no cheering, no celebration. Not yet, because they were still in shallow water, still in enemy territory, still surrounded by patrols that would kill them instantly if detected. And Fluckey knew something else. This escape, miraculous as it was, had created noise, disturbance, and risk. If any Japanese ship was nearby, they would be closing in already. The innovation had worked, but it had also announced their presence. The Barb was alive. Now she would have to fight her way out. The USS Barb rose off the seabed at 2:27 hours, her ascent painfully slow, every foot upward measured in heartbeats. Inside the control room, men spoke in whispers, as if sound itself could betray them. The air was thick, hot, and sour. Battery power was critically low. They had escaped the mud, but not the danger. Flucky ordered the boat to level off just below periscope depth. This was the most dangerous moment of any submarine attack. Too shallow, and the periscope would leave a wake visible for miles. Too deep, and they would be blind. And hey, in the La Peral Strait, enemy ships could be anywhere. Second by second, the Barb crept forward. Sonar reported faint propeller noises. Not merchants, warships. Escorts moving in an irregular pattern, the unmistakable behavior of an active patrol. The Japanese destroyers were hunting, even if they didn't yet know exactly what. Flucky raised the periscope for a split second. What he saw confirmed his worst fear. A Japanese escort destroyer, gray and low in the water, cutting across the strait at high speed. Depth charge racks were clearly visible at the stern. This was not a ship that would hesitate. If it detected the Barb, it would attack until one of them was dead. The crew waited for orders. Flucky made a decision that would define the patrol. Instead of retreating, instead of diving deep and trying to slip away, he chose to attack. It was a calculated risk. The Barb still had torpedoes, and a stealth, if used decisively, could turn the tables. If the attack failed, the boat would not survive a counterattack in such shallow water. The approach was executed with knee-perfect discipline. Course adjusted, speed reduced to a crawl. The destroyer's track intersected the Barb's firing solution. In the torpedo room, sailors prepared the weapons in silence, hands moving by muscle memory learned under months of pressure. At the firing mark, Flucky gave the command. Fire one. The torpedo left the tube with a muted shudder, its propeller spinning to life as it raced toward the target. Seconds stretched. The destroyer continued on its course, unaware. Then, a dull, violent impact. The explosion was not catastrophic, but it was decisive. The torpedo struck near the destroyer's stern, damaging propulsion and steering. The ship lurched, slowing abruptly, smoke and steam venting from her deck. The proof of concept was immediate and undeniable. The Barb could still fight, but success carried consequences. The destroyer did not sink, but she was crippled, and her crew reacted instantly. Signal flares arced into the sky. Guns fired blindly into the water. Other patrol vessels altered course, converging on the explosion site. The hornet's nest had been kicked. Flucky ordered an immediate evasive dive, but there was nowhere to go. Depth was limited. Maneuvering room was almost non-existent. The submarine slipped down just enough to avoid detection, hugging the bottom again without grounding. Moments later, the first depth charges detonated. The explosions were close. Shockwaves slammed into the hull, lights flickering, instruments rattling. Dust and rust fell from overhead. Men gripped pipes and bulkheads to stay upright. The Barb survived the first pattern. Then another, and another. The Japanese escorts, now fully alert, were hunting. Flucky used every trick he had, changing depth by feet, altering course by degrees, exploiting temperature layers, and trusting that his early escape had given him just enough margin to survive. At last, the explosions moved farther away. Sonar reported propellers receding. The escorts believed they had driven the submarine off or destroyed her. They were wrong. The Barb remained operational, battered but alive, having proven two things in a single night. First, that unconventional thinking could save a submarine from the seabed. And second, that even in the enemy's backyard, aggressive action could seize the initiative. But Flucky knew this was only the beginning. The enemy would adapt, and the next encounter would be even deadlier. The night did not end with the Japanese destroyer limping away. For Lieutenant Commander Eugene Flucky, survival was not enough. The Barb had slipped through one net, but the strategic mission remained unchanged: disrupt traffic, self-fear, and prove that no stretch of water near Japan was truly safe. Within hours of the first attack, sonar picked up new contacts. More ships. A small convoy, likely coastal freighters escorted by patrol vessels, moving cautiously through the strait. The escorts zigzagged now, their crews tense, guns manned, sonar active. The earlier explosion had put everyone on edge. Despite low batteries and the damage sustained during the depth charge attack, Flucky ordered the Barb back into position. This was escalation by choice. The crew reloaded torpedo tubes, sweat-soaked and exhausted. Every man aboard understood the risk. A second attack would confirm to the Japanese that something new and aggressive was operating in their waters. It would also invite a much larger response. Flucky accepted that. The second approach was harder. The escorts were alert, constantly changing course. Firing solutions were fleeting, imperfect. When Flucky finally committed, he did so knowing the odds were worse than before. 2 torpedoes were launched. They ran, and missed. For a brief, crushing moment, it seemed the gamble had failed. No explosion, no impact, only the faint, fading whine of torpedo propellers disappearing into the darkness. But even failure had an effect. The escorts reacted violently. Depth charges were dropped immediately, hasty, poorly spaced, more driven by fear than calculation. Searchlights stabbed across the surface. Gunfire erupted at imagined periscope wakes. And in that chaos, the convoy scattered. From the enemy's perspective, the situation was spiraling. Japanese officers knew their doctrine, but doctrine assumed a predictable enemy. Submarines were supposed to attack once, then withdraw. They were not supposed to linger, re-engage, or operate with such apparent audacity in shallow, heavily patrolled waters. Confusion spread up the chain of command. Reports conflicted. Some claimed the submarine had been sunk. Others insisted multiple submarines were present. Sonar contacts were lost and reacquired, sometimes only to vanish again. The escort's coordinated defense began to break down. Orders were shouted. Courses crossed. One patrol vessel nearly collided with another in the darkness. All of this played directly into Flucky's hands. While the escorts chased ghosts, the Barb slipped away, conserving power and repositioning. The damage from the first torpedo hit worsened as the crippled destroyer struggled to stay afloat, drawing resources and attention away from convoy protection. The second attack had not sunk a ship, but it had achieved something arguably more important. It paralyzed the enemy's decision-making. Japanese commanders were now forced to assume the worst. Every sonar contact was a threat. Every ripple was a submarine. Aggression turned into hesitation, and hesitation into mistakes. For the crew of the Barb, the psychological shift was palpable. They were no longer prey. They were the hunters. Yet the danger was far from over. Battery levels were dropping further. Damage control teams reported minor leaks and stress fittings. Another depth charge attack might be the one that broke them. Then came a new report over sonar, one that changed everything. A friendly American unit, another submarine operating nearby, was in serious trouble. Trapped, hunted, and dangerously close to destruction. Flucky faced a choice. He could withdraw, preserve his boat, and escape while he still could. Or he could turn back into the teeth of enemy defenses, risking everything to save others. He didn't hesitate. The report was fragmentary, picked up through imperfect contact and hurried transmission, but its meaning was unmistakable. Another American submarine was in trouble. Somewhere nearby, operating in the same treacherous waters of the WWII Strait, a U.S. boat had been detected and was now under sustained Japanese attack. Escorts were concentrating. Depth charges were falling in disciplined patterns. This was no panic reaction. This was a coordinated kill. For Flucky, the implications were stark. The Barb was already damaged. Batteries were low. Compressed air reserves were dangerously reduced from the earlier escape. Doctrine, common sense, and self-preservation all pointed in one direction. Withdraw immediately. Instead, Flucky turned toward the danger. He knew what it felt like to be trapped in shallow water with destroyers overhead. He knew that another submarine, pinned and hunted, might not get a second chance. If the Barb could distract the escorts, draw even part of their attention, it might be enough. It was a decision rooted not in orders, but in solidarity. The Barb advanced at minimum speed, conserving power, threading through the same narrow depths that had nearly killed her hours earlier. Sonar reports grew more intense, multiple surface contacts, overlapping propeller noises, tight maneuvering patterns. The Japanese had found their prey. Flucky brought the Barb to periscope depth again, risking everything. The periscope broke the surface for seconds, just long enough. What he saw was a nightmare. Two Japanese escorts were executing textbook anti-submarine tactics, circling and attacking a contact area with precision. Depth charges detonated in rolling sequences, walking their explosions across the water. Any submarine caught in that net would be crushed. Flucky had one chance to break it. He ordered a bold, almost reckless maneuver. The Barb would attack the escorts directly, from close range, in shallow water, with limited escape options. It was the kind of move that could either save American lives or doom his own crew. The approach was silent and agonizingly slow. At the firing point, Flucky selected his targets carefully. Not the largest ship, the most dangerous one. He waited until the escort turned, exposing its side. Fire! The torpedo streaked away. This time, the result was devastating. The explosion tore into the escort amidships, lifting steel and flame into the night. The ship shuddered, slowed, and began to list sharply. Men were thrown from their feet. Guns fell silent. Almost immediately, the second escort broke off its attack. The pattern shattered. The Japanese commander now faced an impossible problem. Instead of one trapped submarine, there were two active attackers. Uncertainty replaced confidence. Orders conflicted. The escort split, one moving to assist a damaged ship, the other searching frantically for the new threat. That moment was enough. The hunted American submarine slipped away, but the Barb's ordeal was not over. The surviving escort turned its fury on Flucky's boat. Depth charges rained down again, closer this time. Explosions slammed the hull, buckling internal fittings, knocking men off their feet. A light fixture shattered. Gauges flickered. A small leak opened in a forward compartment. Battery levels dropped further. Air grew worse. The Barb was being pushed to her absolute limit. Flucky ordered a desperate escape, changing course sharply, altering depth by mere feet, using the cluttered seabed and temperature layers as cover. Every decision had to be perfect. There was no margin left. Slowly, agonizingly, the explosions faded. The escort, damaged and low on depth charges, abandoned the hunt. The Barb crept away into deeper water. Hours later, as dawn broke over the strait, Flucky finally allowed himself to surface briefly, just long enough to recharge batteries and assess damage. The submarine was battered, scarred, and exhausted, but she was alive, and so was the American submarine Flucky had gone back to save. Against overwhelming odds, using audacity instead of doctrine, the Barb had turned the tables yet again. This was no longer just a lucky escape. It was a demonstration of something far more dangerous to the enemy: initiative. To understand why the USS Barb survived and why Flucky's unorthodox decisions worked, we need to step away from a narrative and look closely at the machines involved. Underscore the hero's machine, USS Barb SS-220. The Barb was a Gato-class fleet submarine, the backbone of the U.S. Navy's undersea war during World War II. She displaced roughly 1,525-ton surface and measured 311 feet in length. Her pressure hull was built from high-tensile steel, designed to survive depths of around 300 feet, though commanders often exceeded that limit in combat. Propulsion came from 4 diesel engines for surface running and electric motors for submerged operations. This hybrid system gave the Barb impressive range and speed, but also critical vulnerabilities. Submerged endurance depended entirely on battery power. Once batteries ran low, a submarine became slow, blind, and fragile. In shallow water, those vulnerabilities were magnified. The Barb's size, an advantage in open ocean, became a liability in confined straits. Maneuvering room was minimal, and even small depth changes risked grounding. The ballast system and the risk taken. Submarines control buoyancy using ballast tanks that flood with seawater to dive and are blown with compressed air to surface. These systems were designed to handle clean seawater only. Introducing foreign substances, like dish soap, was never contemplated by designers. So could foam, clog valves, or interfere with venting. If the system failed, the submarine could lose the ability to surface entirely. But Flucky's gamble exploited a simple physical principle: friction and suction. The mud of the La Perouse Strait created a suction seal against the hull. By introducing soap into the ballast tanks, the escaping mixture coated the hull and disrupted that seal. Reduced friction allowed the submarine to slide free instead of remaining glued to the seabed. It was crude, it was risky, and it worked. The weapon, Mark 14 torpedoes. By 1945, the Barb was armed primarily with Mark 14 steam torpedoes. Earlier in the war, these weapons were notorious for failures, running too deep, failing to detonate, or detonating prematurely. Many of these flaws had been corrected by the time of Fluckey's patrol, but mistrust lingered. Every torpedo attack still carried uncertainty. What made Fluckey's attacks effective was range and angle. In shallow water, torpedoes ran closer to their intended depth and struck targets in vulnerable areas, near the stern or below the waterline, where propulsion and steering were exposed. Why the tactic worked. Japanese escorts relied on predictable submarine behavior: attack once, then evade. Fluckey broke that pattern by re-engaging, attacking escorts instead of just merchants, and operating aggressively in confined waters. He overloaded enemy decision-making. Technologically, the Barb was not superior to her enemies. Tactically, she was. The combination of mechanical understanding, environmental exploitation, and psychological disruption turned an underdog submarine into a force multiplier. And that had consequences far beyond a single patrol. The patrol of USS Barb in early 1945 did not alter the course of the war overnight, but it struck at something Japan could no longer afford to lose: confidence in the safety of its home waters. In the weeks that followed, Japanese Naval Command was forced to confront a disturbing reality. American submarines were no longer content to operate at the edges of the empire. They were penetrating narrow straits, attacking escorts, and surviving encounters that should have been fatal. The La Perouse Strait, once considered defensible, was now exposed. The immediate consequence was disruption. Shipping through the strait slowed dramatically. Convoys were delayed or rerouted. Escorts were reassigned from other duties to reinforce coastal patrols, thinning Japanese defenses elsewhere. Every destroyer chasing a submarine was one less protecting troop movements or vital supply lines. For the Japanese commanders involved, the fallout was personal. Reports from the area were contradictory and troubling. Submarines appeared to attack repeatedly, vanish, then reappear somewhere else. Escort reported being hit in waters believed too shallow for safe submarine operations. The implication was either extraordinary American skill or a failure of Japanese doctrine. In wartime Japan, failure had consequences. While records are incomplete, officers responsible for coastal defense in the region were quietly reassigned or sidelined. Confidence in aggressive anti-submarine tactics eroded. Patrols became more cautious, more conservative, and less effective. On the American side, Fluckey's actions reinforced a growing truth within the submarine force. Initiative mattered more than strict adherence to doctrine. Submarine commanders were encouraged, informally at least, to think creatively. Patrols became more aggressive in shallow waters. Coastal operations expanded. Submarines began to be seen not just as commerce raiders, but as strategic disruptors capable of forcing disproportionate enemy reactions. The Barb herself became a symbol. Later in the same patrol, Fluckey would take audacity even further, landing a small team ashore in Japan to destroy a railway line, the only ground combat operation conducted on the Japanese home islands by U.S. forces during the war. That act, like the soap-filled ballast tanks, was born of the same philosophy. Rules were tools, not limits. Strategically, these operations contributed to the tightening noose around Japan. As shipping losses mounted and internal transport became vulnerable, shortages worsened. Fuel disappeared. Industry slowed. Civilian hardship deepened. No single submarine caused that collapse. But submarines like the Barb made it inevitable. By the summer of 1945, Japan's maritime lifelines were severed. When surrender came in August, it was not just because of overwhelming firepower, but because the empire had been systematically isolated, starved of movement, and stripped of initiative. Fluckey's patrol was a small but telling chapter in that story. It demonstrated that even in the face of technological parity or inferiority, bold leadership and unconventional thinking could impose strategic costs far beyond tonnage sunk, and it ensured that the name Barb will be remembered long after the war ended. For Eugene Bennett Fluckey, the war did not end in anonymity. His leadership aboard the USS Barb, not just during the grounding incident, but across multiple daring patrols, earned him the Medal of Honor, personally presented for extraordinary heroism during his final wartime patrol in 1945. It was one of the highest recognitions ever awarded to a U.S. submariner, and it reflected more than a single act. It honored a pattern of boldness, innovation, and moral courage under impossible pressure. After the war, Fluckey remained in the U.S. Navy, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He lived a long life, passing away in 2007, long enough to see his once unorthodox ideas studied, celebrated, and taught as examples of adaptive leadership. For decades, he spoke quietly about his crew, not himself, insisting that no innovation mattered without the trust of the men who carried it out. Those men returned home changed. Some stayed in the Navy. Others returned to farms, factories, and classrooms. Like many submariners, they rarely spoke about the patrols that had aged them years and months. There were no parades of men who fought invisible battles underwater. Their reward was survival, and the knowledge that they had done something extraordinary. The machine that carried them, however, did not survive the peace. The USS Barb was decommissioned after the war and eventually scrapped in the early 1950s. Her steel was melted down, her compartments erased. No museum preserved her hull. No harbor displays her silhouette. And yet, her legacy endured. Among submariners, the Barb became legendary, not for her tonnage sunk alone, but for the spirit she represented. She was remembered as a boat that refused to accept the limits imposed by circumstance, doctrine, or fear. On the enemy side, the Japanese escorts damaged or diverted during the Barb patrol faded into obscurity, their crews absorbed into a defeated navy. The officers who faced Fluckey's attacks left behind no grand memoirs, only fragmented reports describing a submarine that behaved unlike any they had encountered before. In the end, the contrast was striking. The steel vanished, the names endured, and the ideas, born in desperation, improvised with dish soap and courage, outlived them all. The story of the USS Barb is not just a tale of steel and seawater. It's a reminder of what happens when human ingenuity is pushed to the edge. Trapped on the ocean floor in enemy waters, with doctrine exhausted and time running out, survival did not come from superior technology or overwhelming force. It came from imagination, from trust between commander and his crew, and from the courage to try something that had never been authorized, tested, or approved. World War II was won by factories and armies, but it was shaped by moments like this, where ordinary people refused to surrender to impossible odds. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps keep these forgotten battles alive. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more true stories of ingenuity and courage from history's darkest hours. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. These stories connect people across generations and continents. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Eugene Fluckey and the crew of the USS Barb never disappear into silence.